Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment. Not automatic when you realize something has shifted inside. You respond differently. You breathe more freely. The world hasn't changed but you have. Healing is never linear, it is quiet, often invisible and deeply personal. It does not announce itself with fireworks. Rather, it arrives subtly. In the way you no longer seek battles, in the peace that lives in the spaces where once there was war. Today, I want to draw your attention not to your wounds, but to the quiet evidence that you have already begun to transcend them. These are the 7 signs you've healed more than you realize. There was a time when the need to be right was almost instinctive, reflexive, automatic, as natural as breathing. In every disagreement, every challenge, every contradiction, there existed a subtle undertow of fear. It wasn't just about the topic at hand. It was about something deeper, something old. It was the fear that being wrong and being unseen, unvalued, or worse, unworthy. So we fought. Not just for logic or clarity, but for survival, for identity, for the fragile sense of self we had built around being correct, intelligent, prepared, and respected. When you are wounded, especially in ways the world cannot see, the ego becomes a shield. You build a fortress of beliefs, ideas, and opinions. Not always because they are true, but because they keep you feeling safe. They give structure to your world, even if that structure becomes a prison. And so, you develop the habit of defensiveness. You interrupt. You over-explain. You raise your voice, not always in anger, but in desperation to be understood, to be acknowledged. You rehearse arguments in your head long after they've ended. You prepare counterpoints to imaginary debates. You attach your worth to your ability to convince, to outsmart, to dominate a conversation. Every disagreement feels a challenge to your very being, and losing one, admitting error, showing vulnerability, feels like a kind of death. But then something begins to shift. Slowly, without announcement. One day someone challenges you, and instead of launching into your well-rehearsed defenses, you pause. You feel the rise of adrenaline, the old pull toward battle, and then you do nothing. Not because you've given up, but because you've grown tired of fighting wars that no longer matter. Because somewhere along the way, peace began to feel more satisfying than victory. You've started to notice the cost of always being right. The energy it drains, the tension it breeds, the isolation it creates. And you've started to value something else instead: harmony, understanding, silence. You begin to realize that winning an argument often leaves both sides wounded, bruised in spirit if not in word. You realize that convincing someone doesn't necessarily create connection. Sometimes the deepest form of wisdom is not in speaking, but in allowing space. Space for other people to have their truths, even if they are different from yours. Space to accept that not every opinion needs to be challenged. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. You let go, not out of apathy, but out of strength. You let go because you no longer need to prove yourself at every turn. Your value is no longer tethered to the approval of others, or to the perception that you are always the most informed, the most articulate, the most correct. And then something beautiful happens. Conversations become easier, relationships become softer, you listen more, you judge less. You learn things you never would have learned if you had stayed attached to the idea of always being right. You start to feel a spaciousness inside yourself, a room where grace can enter, where curiosity can grow. You even start to notice that others feel safer around you, more open, more willing to share, because they sense they won't be met with resistance or correction but with presence. In that space, you begin to understand that true maturity is not about knowing all the answers, but about knowing when to let the questions stand. True healing is not the ability to speak louder, but to feel no urgency to speak at all. There is no scoreboard in the heart. No medals for out-arguing someone you love. No peace in the ashes of a burned bridge. No truth that's worth the cost of wounding another person's spirit, just to claim the high ground. So when you find yourself no longer needing to win every argument, no longer aching for the last word, no longer seeing every disagreement as a threat, know that you are not becoming passive or weak. You are becoming free. Free from the ego's tight grip, free from the need for external validation, free from the child echoes that once demanded you be perfect to be safe. And in that quiet freedom, something soft and enduring begins to emerge. A strength that does not shout, a confidence that does not compete, and a self that no longer needs to be right to be whole. There was a time when the smallest thing could send your nervous system into chaos. A tone of voice. A glance that felt too sharp, a delayed reply, a closed door, a certain word or phrase. It could pull you straight into a storm before you even understood what was happening. It was as if your body remembered something your conscious mind had long forgotten. The trigger would hit, and suddenly you were no longer in the present moment. You were in an old memory, in an old wound, reliving the fear, the rejection, the shame, And it didn't matter how much logic you tried to apply. Your heart would race. Your thoughts would spiral, and your reactions would be quick, often louder than you wanted, sharper than you meant, more destructive than you realized until the aftermath revealed itself in hurt silence or fractured connection. You weren't reacting to what was happening. You weren't reacting to everything that had ever happened, all at once. And in those moments, it felt like you were not in control of yourself. The world was poking at wounds that had never fully closed. You would try to calm yourself down, try to talk yourself out of the emotion, but the body doesn't lie, it doesn't forget. The healing you thought was done would unravel in seconds, and you'd be left wondering why you still hadn't gotten over it. Why it still felt so raw. You might have even judged yourself for still being so sensitive, for still being so easily set off, as if your feelings made you broken or weak. But then, without realizing when or how exactly, something began to change. A moment came, a similar situation, the same kind of trigger, but this time you paused. You felt the heat rising in your chest, the tightness in your throat, the impulse to defend, to flee, to lash out. But you didn't obey it, you noticed it, you sat with it. Maybe it still hurt, maybe it still made your hands shake a little. But you didn't become the reaction. You stayed, you breathed. You observed yourself from a higher place. A place that could feel the pain but wasn't ruled by it. You didn't explode, you didn't shut down, you didn't sabotage the moment just to escape the discomfort, you chose awareness over reaction. And that moment, quiet, small, unnoticed by the world, was monumental. It is in those moments, the ones no one else sees, that healing reveals itself. Not in the total disappearance of pain, but in the space between the feeling and the choice. You still feel triggered, yes. But now there's a gap between the trigger and the action. And in that gap lies your power. That gap is the proof. You have grown, you have changed, you are no longer at the mercy of every echo from your past. You are no longer possessed by your old programming. The trigger may still knock at your door, but you no longer invite it to take over the whole house. And slowly, this space grows wider. What once overwhelmed you now merely brushes against you. What once ruled you now informs you. You start to ask deeper questions, not about how to stop feeling, but about what the feeling is trying to show you. You become curious instead of reactive, gentle instead of judgmental. You begin to trace the trigger back to its origin. And in doing so you give it context. And with context comes understanding, with understanding comes compassion. And with compassion comes the true alchemy of healing. The ability to witness your own pain without becoming it. This is not about never being triggered again. That is not the goal. Life will continue to present you with mirrors, with tests, with echoes of the places that still ask for your attention. But when you can face those moments with awareness instead of fear, with presence instead of panic, with softness instead of shame, you have stepped into a new dimension of yourself. One that is not ruled by survival but by sovereignty. One where the past may visit, but it no longer owns the room. And in that room, now filled with breath and stillness, you find something you hadn't known you were searching for. Your own presence, unshaken, untouched. Watching from within with eyes that no longer see the trigger as a threat, but as a teacher calling you back to yourself again and again, without blame, without resistance. Just a quiet unfolding into the person you were always becoming. Comes a point in your healing where you begin to feel the subtle shift between pleasing and protecting. Between stretching yourself thin to keep others comfortable, and standing firmly in the quiet truth of your own needs. In the early stages of your journey, setting boundaries can feel like betrayal. It can feel like shutting a door too loudly. In a house where you were taught to whisper your discomfort and smile through your exhaustion. You were conditioned to believe that love meant sacrifice, that kindness meant self-erasure, that saying yes was always safer than saying no. And so you did. You tolerated, you absorbed, you made space for everyone else even when it left none for you. You apologized for taking up room, for having limits, for being human in a world that often rewarded you more for being useful than for being whole. But that survival strategy, while once necessary, begins to falter. You start to feel the cost of it, not just emotionally but physically, energetically, spiritually. The resentment begins to build, silently at first, showing up as fatigue, detachment, or anxiety that you can't trace to any single cause. And still, you say yes, because saying no feels like conflict, and conflict has always felt like danger. You've learned to avoid it at all costs, even if it costs you yourself. But the turning point doesn't come all at once. It's gradual. It comes in moments where you notice that every time you abandon your boundaries, you abandon yourself. It comes when you realize that people don't love you more for what you tolerate. They often expect you to tolerate more. It comes when you begin to grieve the version you that kept quiet just to be liked, just to feel safe. One day it happens. Maybe your voice shakes. Maybe your palms sway, but you say it. You say no, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with clarity. You honor your own limit, and the world doesn't end. The ground doesn't collapse. Someone may push back, someone may walk away, but for the first time, you don't follow them. You stay with yourself. You feel the ache of guilt, but also the pulse of freedom beneath it. That guilt is old, borrowed from years of false obligation. But the freedom is new, and it feels unfamiliar because you've rarely allowed it to lick this fully in your body. The more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. You stop over-explaining. You stop cushioning every boundary with 10 layers of apology. You realize that your needs are not a burden. They are part of your design. You learn that saying no doesn't mean shutting out love, but making room for a love that doesn't require your self-abandonment to survive. As your boundaries strengthen, so does your self-respect. You no longer see yourself as selfish for having limits, you see yourself as honest. You become someone you can trust. Someone who protects your own energy the same way you used to protect everyone else's comfort. And this shift changes your relationships. Some fall away, some resist the new you. But some deepen, some people rise to meet the healthier version of you. You start attracting those who honor your no just as much as your yes. Who don't need you to shrink in order to feel safe around your power. You begin to see that boundaries are not walls, they are gates. They are not about keeping people out, but about choosing with discernment who gets access to your sacred inner world. And eventually, what once felt like an act of rebellion now feels like a return home. You recognize that protecting your peace is not a punishment to others but a promise to yourself. You no longer feel the need to explain every decision of your worth through your sacrifices. You find strength in being misunderstood if it means being honest. You find rest in your own self-trust. You feel your life begin to align, not because everyone around you approves, but because you finally approve of yourself without waiting for permission or apology. There was a time when you believed that love meant carrying the weight of someone else's pain as if it were your own, when empathy became entanglement, and helping meant absorbing, fixing, rescuing at the cost of your own energy and balance. You mistook overextension for compassion, and self-abandonment for kindness, thinking that being there for someone, being there at all costs, even when your own spirit was quietly asking for space, for silence, for rest. You measured your worth by how much you could offer. How many emotional fires you could put out before you collapsed under the weight of it all, and you didn't question it because you were praised for it. For being strong, for being selfless. For being the one who holds everything together, while quietly falling apart on the inside. You learned, early on, that being needed felt like being loved, and so you built a role for yourself, the caretaker, the fixer, the one who never says no, who listens endlessly, who solves what others won't even acknowledge. But underneath that role was a quiet grief, because as you gave more and more, you received less and less in return, not because others were cruel, but because they became accustomed to your silence, your yes, your emotional labor. They didn't always see the cost because you didn't show it. You didn't let them. You wore the mask of resilience so convincingly that even you forgot it was a mask. Until you couldn't anymore, and then something subtle began to shift. Not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. Not from anger, but from a longing to know it would feel like to be supported without having to earn it. To be listened to without offering a solution, to be allowed to be soft without guilt. Slowly you began to recognize the patterns, not just in others but in yourself. You started to see how your worth had become entangled with usefulness. How your boundaries had been shaped more by fear than by choice. How your empathy had morphed into self-neglect disguised as virtue. You began to unlearn. You began to notice the places where you gave not from overflow, but from depletion, and how that kind of giving was not noble. It was unsustainable. One day, you sat across from someone in pain, and for the first time, you didn't rush to fix them. You didn't interrupt their silence with advice, with their sorrow with solutions. You stayed, you listened. You held space without losing your center. You didn't absorb their emotions as your own, and you didn't make their healing your responsibility. And in that moment, you realized that presence is enough. That love does not always mean doing. That sometimes the most sacred thing you can offer is your calm, your stillness, your grounded being. Not as a savior, but as a witness. And slowly, this way of being became your new rhythm. You stopped pouring from an empty cup. You learned to check in with yourself before saying yes. You began to notice when your compassion was tipping into codependency, and you gently pulled yourself back. Not with shame but with wisdom. You stopped performing emotional labor for people and willing to do their own. You became less available for chaos that demanded your peace as payment. And in doing so, you became more available to yourself, to your truth, to your own emotional clarity. Your relationships began to shift. Some resisted your new boundaries, others fell away naturally, no longer sustained by the imbalance that once held them together. But new connections also emerged, ones rooted in reciprocity, in presence, in respect. You found people who didn't need you fix them in order to feel loved, who saw your calm not as a void to fill, but as a grounding to honor. You began to feel safe in the spaces where you didn't have to perform your value, where being was enough. This is how you know you're healing. When you can sit in someone else's storm without trying to control the weather. When you can offer love without losing yourself in the process. When you can hold space without disappearing inside it. When your compassion is no longer a doorway for self-erasure, but a mirror reflecting the balance you've worked so hard to reclaim. There comes a moment when you begin to see through the repetition, when the faces may change, the circumstances may shift slightly, but the emotional script remains hauntingly familiar. The same arguments, the same roles, the same ache that follows decisions you promised yourself you wouldn't repeat. It used to feel like bad luck, like the universe was conspiring against your growth, like you were somehow doomed to circle the same lessons in an endless loop. But what you didn't realize then, is that life has a way of repeating what we haven't yet resolved, echoing what we've avoided, mirroring back what remains unhealed, not to punish, but to awaken. And for a long time, you didn't know it was a pattern. You just thought it was your life. You told yourself it was normal to feel drained, to chase love, to settle for half-truths and fragments of joy because that was all you had known. Familiarity has a strange way of disguising itself as safety, even when it's slowly unraveling you from the inside. But healing begins with awareness, and awareness is rarely comfortable. One day you catch yourself mid-reaction, mid-decision, mid-emotion, and something pauses inside of you. You recognize the feeling before it takes you under. You see the resemblance between this moment and so many others you've lived through before. You hear the familiar script beginning in your mind. Maybe it's the need to over-explain, to shrink, to control, to abandon your own needs just to keep the peace. But this time, you hesitate. You watch it. You don't run with it. That moment of recognition, subtle and quiet, is a revolution. You begin to understand that the pattern is not your identity. It is a learned response. It is a habit of survival, not a reflection who you truly are. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It's disorienting at first. Because with clarity comes grief. The grief of all the times you played a part in your own suffering without realizing it. The grief of understanding how often you kept yourself small because small felt safe, how often you accepted less because less felt familiar. But instead of turning away, you begin to get curious. You trace the thread of your reactions back to their origins. You start asking, when did I first feel this way? Who taught me that this was love? Whose voice is this in my head telling me I don't deserve more? And in asking those questions, you start peeling back the layers. You start separating your truth from your trauma, your identity from your instinct to survive. Soon, something powerful happens. You find yourself in a familiar situation, but you make a different choice. Maybe you speak up where you used to stay silent. Maybe you walk away where you once would have clung. Maybe you set a boundary, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And everything doesn't fall apart like you feared it would. In fact, things begin to align in ways they never did before. Because this time, you're not acting from the wound. You're acting from the wisdom that came through facing it. The pattern begins to loosen its grip, not because the world changed, but because you did. You realize that healing is not always about grand gestures or dramatic transformation. Sometimes it's in the tiniest pivot, the smallest interruption of an old cycle, the quiet moment where you tell yourself a new truth, instead of rehearsing the old lie. You stop seeking people who feel like home was built in chaos. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop abandoning yourself for connection. You choose differently. Not because you're trying to be someone else, but because you're finally remembering who you were before you learned to betray yourself for belonging. And the more you choose differently, the more freedom you begin to feel. Not the freedom that screams, but the kind that hums beneath your skin. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. The patterns may still whisper, still tempt, still try to pull you back, but now you know the sound of your own voice beneath them. And every time you listen to it, every time you choose awareness over repetition, you reclaim another piece of yourself that was waiting to be remembered. There was a time when silence felt unbearable. When the absence of noise, company, distraction, or validation created a kind of panic you couldn't quite name. Being alone wasn't just uncomfortable. It was threatening. Because it forced you to be with yourself, and you weren't yet a safe place to land. You reached outward constantly, not just for connection, but for escape, from your own thoughts, from your own pain, from the parts of you that hadn't yet been met with compassion. Loneliness didn't just visit you in empty rooms. It followed you even in crowded ones. Because no amount of external presence could fill the internal absence you were quietly living with. You stayed in conversations that didn't nourish you, relationships that didn't see you, environments that drained you, all because being with something felt better than being with nothing. You kept busy. You kept moving. You filled your days with noise, with tasks, with interactions that masked the ache you didn't yet know how to soothe. You thought stillness was stagnation, that rest was laziness, that solitude was a sign of lack. So you kept running from your own company, afraid of what might surface in the quiet. Afraid that what you'd find within yourself might confirm the fear that you were not enough on your own. You tried to fill the void with more. More connection. More stimulation, more doing. But the more you filled it with what wasn't real, the emptier it seemed to become, and then, something began to shift. It didn't happen all at once. It began with small moments. Maybe again when the silence didn't feel so sharp, when the stillness began to resemble peace more than punishment. Maybe a moment where you were alone, and instead of reaching for your phone or your calendar or your coping mechanism, you simply sat. You breathed. You noticed the world without needing to interact with it. You noticed yourself without needing to escape. And it startled you how still it felt. How safe, how quiet. Not the kind of quiet that screams with suppressed emotion, but the kind that invites you inward with open hands. You started spending time with yourself not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You began to trust your own presence. You began to learn the sound of your own inner voice, its rhythm, its depth, its wisdom. And in learning it, you stopped needing so much noise to drown it out. You started to see that your own company wasn't something to endure, but something to enjoy. You read alone. You ate alone. You walked alone. And somewhere in all that aloneness, you found a fullness that surprised you. You discovered that solitude is not the same as isolation. That quiet is not the same as emptiness. That your value does not rise and fall based on how many people want access to you in any given moment. The fear began to dissolve. The old compulsion to fill space began to ease. You no longer accepted invitations out of guilt or fear of missing out. You no longer reached out to people just to distract yourself from being with yourself. You learned to discern between loneliness and longing, between disconnection and spaciousness. You stopped confusing attention for affection, noise for connection, presence for love. You realized that the person you most needed to belong to was yourself. Then now, the alone moments are sacred. They are no longer a punishment, they are a return. You go inward not to hide, but to reconnect. You unplug not to escape, but to remember. You are no longer searching for someone else to complete what has already been made whole. You have become your own anchor, your own comfort, your own clarity. And the world begins to reflect that back to you. Not through endless company or noise, but through people and moments that meet you in your fullness. Not your lack, because you've learned to meet yourself there first without needing to be filled, fixed, saved, or seen by anyone outside the quiet home you've built within yourself. There is a point in your journey where something unexpected happens. Something that doesn't come with celebration or applause. Something you almost miss because it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like surrender. It's when you look back at everything you've carried. Everything you've survived. Everything that once brought you to your knees in grief or rage or confusion. And instead of tightening your chest or clenching your fists, you exhale. You stop asking why it happened, stop wishing it had been different. Stop replaying the scenes like a film that owes you a better ending. You stop trying to rewrite the past and start listening to it instead. Not as something to resist, but as something that shaped you in ways you could never have understood why you were still inside it. The pain that once felt senseless begins to reveal its meaning. Not as justice, not as fairness, but as alchemy. You begin to see how it carved depth into you, how it made space for compassion you never had before, how it forced you to meet yourself in the rawest places, where masks don't survive and distractions fall silent. You begin to understand that the version of you that was broken open is not a version to be ashamed of, but a version to be honored. Because that version sat with pain when it would have been easier to numb. That version kept going, even when there were no guarantees. That version held your future self like a promise it intended. There was a time when even thinking about the past would bring tears. Would bring tension in your body. Would reopen something you didn't know how to close. But now, you find yourself remembering, and not collapsing. You can speak about it without shaking. You can revisit it without reliving it. You tell the story not from the center of the wound, but from the scar, and that scar is not something you hide anymore. It has become a part of your language, your strength. Your true healing doesn't mean erasing what happened. It means integrating it so fully that it no longer defines you. But it deepens you. You look at who you used to be with something gentler than judgment. You remember the choices you made in survival and stop punishing yourself for not knowing what you know now. You understand that healing is not a straight line, not a clean process, not a timeline anyone else can set for you. It is messy and sacred and full of moments when you thought you were failing, but you were actually becoming. Becoming someone who doesn't run from pain, but doesn't live in it either. Becoming someone who knows how to hold sorrow without letting it bury joy. Becoming someone who can sit with someone else's story, without making it about their own. Because you've sat with your own long enough to stop needing it to be the loudest voice in the room. And perhaps the deepest sign that you've healed is this: gratitude. Not just for the healing itself, but for the wound that led you to it. A quiet thank you, not because the pain was good or deserved or necessary, but because it led you inward. Because it broke the surface of your life and revealed everything that was buried beneath the noise. Because it brought you to your knees. And from your knees you learned how to rise in a different way. Not with armor but with awareness. Not with bitterness but with wisdom. Not with vengeance. But with grace. You begin to see your life not as a series of things that happened to you, but as a series of things that called you back to yourself. Every heartbreak, every ending, every moment that stripped you of thought you were made space for who you actually are. And now you carry it all differently. Not as weight, but as light. Not as a story of damage but as a story of return. Not as something to escape but as something to stand on, to speak from, to build with. To bless without having to understand every detail. Or why it had to hurt the way it. Before it taught you how to come home to yourself fully. And finally without conditions or shame. So if you've been wondering, have I really healed? Look closer. Healing is not about becoming someone else. It's about coming home to who you were before the world told you who to be. It's not loud, it's not always visible. But it is sacred. Celebrate your subtle strength. You've healed more than you realize. And your journey is far from over.